Hi, welcome back to Focal Point, Free for All Friday on Focal Point. Staff talked to me on the break. I'm not having enough fun. I told them this morning, Free for All Friday, we're just going to have some fun. Haven't had any fun today, so before I introduce my next guest, here's a story about horse meat lasagna being recalled in Sweden. So they're making lasagna in Sweden out of horse meat. Somebody tumbled to it, got onto them. Now they're having to recall 20,000 frozen lasagna meals in the country of Sweden. So we are having fun right here on Focal Point. Now I want to welcome to our decision maker line a good friend of this program and a good friend of mine, Steve Deace. Steve is a nationally syndicated radio talk show host, and we've been a guest at different times on each other's programs. Steve, welcome to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Thank you, Brian. Good to hear from you again. How you been?
Great, Dan. It's great to have you on, Steve. And I want to get right to what I want to talk with you about, because what I want to talk to you about is Karl Rove. And I've got a story in front of me, New York Times over the weekend. Top GOP donors seek greater say in Senate races, and it's obviously talking about Karl Rove and American Crossroads. And, you know, basically the impression you get from this New York Times piece is Karl Rove is out to decimate the Tea Party, to take on and to take out the genuine conservatives in the Republican Party. Is that how you read it?
I don't know how you can read it as anything else. And, I mean, this is stuff that some of us have known was going on behind the scenes, and many of us have suspected was true, but probably didn't want to admit to ourselves. But this is a little bit now like the devil comes. You come home, and the devil is in your living room, in your lazy boy with your remote, and then looks at you and says, "Hey, you got anything cold to drink?" I mean, it's just that brazen now, and it's out in the open. And I think we're better off. You know. There's a reason they always try to arrest Jesus privately, quietly, when it's dark out. They didn't arrest him at the temple because the masses would turn on them. And there's a reason people like Rove and his ilk similarly operate in the shadows. And because something tends to happen when you shine the light of truth on cockroaches, they scurry. And this time they've decided they want to go ahead and not scurry and stand and fight. And I'm just fine with that, because I'm pretty confident this is a fight that they will lose.
Well, and Karl Rove has been out there, Steve, and you've seen him. He's been out there trying to defend himself with his little whiteboard and all that, and trying to say, "Oh, I'm the biggest fan the Tea Party has ever had. We're going to get behind those Tea Party candidates. We love them. We're gonna support genuine conservatives." Do you believe anything he was saying?
No, I don't. I just don't. Ultimately, you know a tree, Brian, as you well know, and your audience knows. You know a tree by its fruit. And, listen, Karl Rove did an effective job of uniting the conservative movement behind George W. Bush. His candidacy, as you'll recall, back in the 2000 primary, was in a lot of trouble. He had been routed in New Hampshire, routed in Michigan, and he made a stand in South Carolina beginning at Bob Jones University. And Karl Rove united social conservatives and people we now know as Tea Partiers behind George W. Bush, rode those people to the White House. His presidency was in peril in 2004. That was an election probably the Democrats should have won, just as this is an election this last year the Republicans probably should have won. And they had a unique, massive turnout of the base. They probably won Ohio only because there was a marriage amendment on the ballot that drove out even more of the base in the state that determined the election. And then they went about their entire second term essentially betraying all of those people that got them there with even more big government than they gave us in the first term. And that really gave birth to what we now know as the Tea Party movement, where those passions were finally spilled over because of Obama's policies. And so, Rove has had issues with these people all along. He's never had issues with using us. He certainly had issues, though, with keeping his promises. And now that we're at the point now where we're facing, frankly, societal survival. I mean, this is a clash of worldviews. It's literally a matter of life and death, of freedom and liberty in America. To people like Rove, as I wrote for Politico this week, Brian, they do not see it the same way you and I do. They see this as merely dueling self-interest between them and the left. And if you think the things people like you and I and the people in your audience think, as one of his big donors told Politico yesterday, you're a, quote, nutcase. And that's really what we're up against right now.
And it seems that the reality, Steve, right now, and I'm with you. I like the fact that some of the shadows are gone, the outlines have become clearer, the landscape is coming into the full light of day, the sun is up, we're seeing things, we're no longer seeing men like trees walking about, we're seeing them for who they are. That now is probably the best time for this stark contrast to emerge. And it looks to me like we really got three political parties right now in America. We have the Democrats always march in lockstep. Then we have the ruling class Republicans like Karl Rove, and we have the citizen class Republicans represented by you and me and the great grassroots in America.
I think that's a very good analogy. People always refer to this as the party of Reagan. I point out to people all the time, I don't know. You tell me if it's the party of Reagan or not. Ford, then Reagan, then Bush, then Dole, then Bush, then McCain, then Romney. I mean, one of these things is not like the other. Reagan is the aberration, not the other way around. And I have people, I'm sure you have listeners that say to you all the time, I've had enough. Is it time for a third party? And I tell those people all the time, hey, listen, why don't we see if we can get a second party before we try a third party?
Yeah, that's a good thought. So it seems like the stakes are really, really high, and the fact that we're 4 years away from the next presidential debate. Of course, we got the election of 2014, obviously, is on the radar, and that's coming up right around the corner. But probably good that this stark contrast has emerged now, so that this, whatever needs to happen to kind of resolve this. And Steve, I'm looking at what Jonathan Collegio, who is Karl Rove's spokesman, he's out there calling Brent Bozell, who's one of us. He's a genuine conservative, fiscal, social conservative, calling him a hater. And instead of backing down, he's been doubling down on that kind of terminology, the way he's speaking to a conservative, which seems to emphasize the fact that these guys really are the enemies of genuine social conservatives.
I have said something for years that up until recently I think a lot of people didn't want to believe was true. And I've only experienced this in my own life. First of all, I'm being an activist in the First in the Nation caucus state, then doing a nationally syndicated show. If you do what I do for a living and live where I live, you get to see the system from the inside out. And the conclusion I've drawn is the only political party in America that hates Christians more than the Democrats is the Republicans. And I'll give you an example. We had just yesterday in my home state, we had one of our pro-life champions in our state legislature file a personhood bill, the idea that life begins at conception, that actually had 8 or 9 of the Republicans co-sponsor the bill at its first filing. And the reaction I'm told we got from our Rhino governor, Terry Branstad, is they're going to primary this guy again. Now, they just primaried him 2 years ago. They lost in a rout. He got 80% of the vote. They're so mad. They're so mad that he did this because, they don't want to detract from his agenda, which is actually the biggest expansion of statist education, which is advocated by the NEA, a Republican governor throwing out education reforms that are advocated by the National Education Association. He's the guy that's so mad at the social conservative doing pro-life legislation, he wants to primary him. And that's really what we're facing right now around the country.
I'm looking at a story here on Breitbart.com, Steve, a poll by Quinnipiac University saying that for the first time, a majority of Republicans disapprove of the job that the GOP is doing in Congress. Not a majority of the American people, but the majority of Republicans. 51% of Republicans don't like the job they're doing in Congress, just 41% support. And you wonder if it has something to do with this drift away from genuine conservatism.
For too long, Brian, if I could just be really blunt, for too long I think we have acted as if the baby is less dead if the Republican kills it, and my money's less stolen if the Republican takes it. And we have sort of devolved elections into sporting outcomes. Yeah, you're a sports fan. I'm one. So it's a little bit like, it's my favorite team wins, and I emotionally feel better about myself, regardless of whose ox is getting gored and what actually is the agenda here. And I think we're ceasing to look at this emotionally and looking at it much more critically and getting beyond personalities and factions and looking at issues. And the reality is, if we're just going to be cold-blooded about it, if you had a brand that you believed in called conservatism or the Republican Party, you are better off seeing these policies come from your opponent than come from you, so it doesn't tarnish your brand at all. I mean, if this is the kind of government we're going to get from Republicans, I would just as soon let Democrats be in office, because your organization knows this. You guys grassroots organize all over the country. Is it easier or harder to organize and activate and engage our people against the left or a bad Republican? I think you and I both know the answer to that.
Well, and I've speculated about this frequently, Steve, and talked about it. You look at the way the Republicans are retreating on the immigration issue. You look at the way they have backed away from the issue of the sanctity of marriage, how they're not interested in the sanctity of life. You're seeing that right there in Iowa. And I saw an article, I don't remember who wrote it, but I think it was on National Review Online maybe, or maybe Heritage Foundation, but it echoed my thoughts exactly. What does this party stand for? What do they stand for? They signed the fiscal cliff bill, raised taxes $620 billion, so they can't say they're the party of fiscal conservatism. They're retreating on every other front, so you got to ask yourself the question, what in the world does the Republican Party stand for? Now, one last thing. We're running out of time. Got a couple minutes left, but I'm thinking maybe, Steve, talking here with Steve Deace of the Steve Deace Show, nationally syndicated radio host, and an activist up in the state of Iowa, which is the first caucus in the country, so very, very important, first primary, so very, very important state, that maybe ground zero in this battle with Karl Rove and the establishment Republicans is going to be right there in the state of Iowa and revolve around Steve King.
Well, there's a reason they had his picture in that New York Times article. And the ironic thing is that I did hear from some conservatives who love Steve King, Brian, who privately told me when Harkin stepped down that they were concerned that he was maybe too combustible to win a statewide election. And now those same conservatives who are expressing those concerns to me privately, now that Karl Rove and the New York Times are piling on, now they will be extremely disappointed if Steve King does not run. And that's the boomerang effect. If he really wanted to have a conversation about how to be more successful in elections, if you really view yourself as part of a family or a team or a coalition, this is not the way that you do it. And instead what he's going to do is give every candidate that he supports the scarlet letter. And if anything, he has been the biggest boon to Steve King's primary chances in the Iowa Senate race than he could have possibly imagined.
Well, I think, Steve, we've got about 45 seconds left, but I think you look at, you used to be able to say, well, we know who the most successful or effective conservatives are by the ones that the mainstream media goes after. Now we may be able to identify the most effective conservatives by looking at the ones that Karl Rove goes after. 30 seconds.
Amen, Brian. You're almost better off in this point in a primary getting Barack Obama's endorsement than Karl Rove's.
All right. My guest has been Steve Deace, host of the nationally syndicated radio program, The Steve Deace Show. You can hear him on our network every night, 9 p.m. Central Time, right here on the AFR Talk Network. So he's a colleague, fellow talk show host here on our network. Steve, can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking time. I know you're busy doing show prep of your own. Thanks for taking time with us. I just appreciate your input, my friend.
Anytime, brother. Let me know if you need any help in the future. God bless.
Steve Deace has been our guest there. And, interesting to me, Steve saying, we need to start a third party. And Steve saying, hey, why don't we get a second party first? Right now, it's hard to draw a clear delineation between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Where do they differ? They're not differing on immigration. They don't differ on fiscal responsibility. They don't differ on marriage right now. They don't differ on abortion. So what does this party stand for? Focal Point, AFR Talk.